Welcome to the Nerd Journey Podcast. Our goal is to help you, the technology professional, accelerate your career progression, increase your job satisfaction, and be more effective in your existing role.
We want to bring listeners like you the career advice we wish we'd been given earlier in our careers.
I'm John White, at VJourneyman on Twitter, sharing co-host duties with Nick Cordy at NetworkNerd_.
We're two former IT operations guys who have moved on to pre-sales roles with technology vendors. We have our opinions, but we also like to highlight the journeys of others and see what we can learn from them.
We'd also like to ask for your feedback to make this a conversation, not a one-way broadcast. Email us at nerdjourneypodcast@gmail.com or DM us at nerdjourney on Twitter. So come join us on our nerd journey.
Let's take a trip. Episode 303. Imagine you've been helping someone else build PowerPoint slides for a session that's going to be presented at a technology conference. In fact, you're going to co-present with that person. And then imagine 2 to 3 weeks before the session is going to take place that your co-presenter backs out. That means it's up to you to present that session on your own. In this case, to a room of over 700 people. Oh, by the way, up to this point, you've only presented to a room of no more than 5 people at a time. How anxious do you feel right now? Duncan Epping is a chief technologist, a published author, a blogger, and someone who once had a crippling fear of public speaking. In this week's discussion, we wanted to have Duncan on the show to share some of the lessons he's learned doing presentations throughout the course of his career. You'll get to hear all the details of the story of Duncan's first public speaking experience that I described a little bit earlier. Duncan will share how he learns new things through writing and how that actually translates really well into building presentations. One thing Duncan consistently does when he builds a presentation is he thinks through what the audience might want to know. Let's get you to part 1 of our discussion with Mr. Duncan Epping.
Duncan Epping, welcome to the Nerd Journey Podcast.
Thanks.
Can you tell us a little bit about who you are and your current job right now?
Sure, no problem. It's probably good to start off with where I live because that may be slightly different than where most of the people live listening or that were part of the show. I live in the Netherlands in for the Netherlands, a pretty big town, but for US, probably a small town. It's about 100,000 people. So I live in the south of the Netherlands in a place called Helmond, which is near a city which some of you may be familiar with, Eindhoven. And those who know Eindhoven probably know it because of all of the technology that happened there in the past with Philips and now ASML. So that's a pretty big city by itself. Now, I work for Broadcom, I should probably say right now, but in the past, of course, VMware as a chief technologist. And I'm part of the currently VCF business unit or division. And in the past, I've been part of the storage and availability team, the vSAN team, tech marketing teams, professional services. I think I've been all over the place within the company. The only thing that I probably haven't done is sales and pre-sales. But other than that, I've done most of the other technical roles that you would expect probably from someone like myself. But in the early days, mainly focused on things like implementation. And then purely when I started out, of course, vSphere, like it was for most people. And then later it started to be, other focus areas, things like Site Recovery Manager, VMware Cloud Director, or VCD as it was called back in the day. I think I've been all over the place. So yeah, pretty much pretty diverse, I would say.
Absolutely. And that diversity has actually come out in a lot of the different blogs you've written and a lot of presentations because you are quite well known in our industry, Duncan, for being a presenter, whether it's keynoting or doing breakout sessions at conferences. And based on our DM conversation, I kind of wanted to have a focused conversation on this aspect of presentations, because that is a skill that we've heard a lot of our guests say that it helped them be better technologists. It helped them get into roles that made more money. But let's start here. I feel like I heard a long time ago in an episode of the Geek Whisperers that your first public presentation was at a technology conference with hundreds of people. Is that accurate?
Yeah, pretty much. And it's probably good to start off with how I got into that, because it's a pretty funny story, and it's also probably something I would never recommend anyone doing or repeating, because it was also very daunting. It's quite a scary experience. But basically, what happened is I was doing a lot of blog posting around vSphere HA. And I had a lot of conversations with the HA team over the years, basically trying to figure out how stuff worked, and if I found something that didn't work, or I got a different result as customers would expect, I would always engage with the product management team and with the engineering team. Now, the engineering team had been doing these vSphere HA deep dives for I don't know how long. They'd been doing it for years already. So at some point in time, one of these guys reaches out to me and says, you do a lot of writing on vSphere HA. You wrote most of the best practices that are out there. Would you be willing to join us? And maybe, help us create some slides or join us up on the stage. I said, well, I'm happy to help you create some slides, but I'm not going to do any public speaking. I'm not going to start doing that now. It's an interesting thing because when they asked me, I had presented before, but it was probably for a group of like 5 or 6 people. More like a group discussion than it basically was a presentation. And it usually was with peers as well. Now, just to paint the picture, even when I needed to do that, I would always get extremely terrified. So I had a pretty big fear of public speaking in general. Like in high school, typically when I had to do some kind of presentation, I would call in sick in the morning. I maybe have done 1 or 2, but all the other times I would call in sick. And it's not like I wasn't sick, I was just too afraid to go. I would get physically sick because I was so nervous of the presentation that was coming up. So I had to call in sick and just stay at home. But I got asked for this to help at least with the slides or the presentation itself, and so I started developing the slides with the developer, with the lead engineer for HA back then, and we went through this, and I probably created half of the slides or something like that. So he did most of the technical deep things, and then I did some of the focus areas in terms of best practices. So it was like 50-50. And after we've created that slide deck, we went over it together, basically discussing what should be told during a particular section of the deck itself, and explaining what my focus areas would be if I would talk about this topic with a customer. And then after we did that, he said, it probably makes sense for you to do those slides. You know them in and out, and it can't be a problem to go up on stage and repeat what you just done with me. I said, you know what? Let me think about that. So I thought about it for a day, and of course, various reasons, we will probably get into that, why I figured I should do it. And I asked him, okay, if I'm going to do this, how many people will show up? He said, well, in my experience, typically around 100 people, 125. We had one really big one a couple of years ago, which was 150, but it was the very first time that we had vSphere HA out in the market. So it's probably going to be around 100. So I'm like, dude, I've never done more than 5 people. I wouldn't even get in front of a classroom with people that I know extremely well. So 100 people for me is insane. But, I more or less convinced myself somehow to still do it. So I ended up signing up for it. And we were planned to do that session together in San Francisco it was. So it was probably, 3-4 weeks before the event. He reaches out to me and he says, I've got a problem. I won't be able to go to VMworld. I'm like, why? What's going on? He says, well, the issue is we've got a couple of huge bugs. There's a release going out the week after VMworld, or probably during VMworld, and I need to make sure that we actually fix those issues. That is, my main job responsibility. And I can't go to VMworld and let other people solve the mess that I more or less created. So I'm responsible for that. I can't go. I'm like, okay, now what? He said, well, there's already people that signed up for the session. Someone needs to deliver the session. There's no one from the HA team that can go. So unfortunately, you probably need to do it by yourself. I'm like, okay, whether I do, half of the slides or I do the full deck, it is what it is. I'm just going to do it by myself. So I, again, convinced myself that I should be okay. And he actually handed over officially the session in the back end to myself, which then meant I could log into the back end of the event itself, and I actually could see how many people signed up. So I logged in, and I expected to see 100 people, 120 people, but it wasn't 100 or 120. It ended up being 600 plus people that already signed up.
Oh, man.
Oh, my.
And it got worse because on the day itself, the room was actually completely packed. So it was like 750 or 760 people or something like that.
Oh, no.
So, yeah, you can imagine that if you're terrified of public speaking and your very first session is at VMworld, which at that point in time was 20,000, 22,000 people, whatever it was, a huge number. And then you're actually in one of the bigger rooms and the room is completely packed, that it's going to be a crazy experience. So that's why I said it's something that I probably would never recommend anyone to do. This is not the order in which you should be, doing public speaking in any shape or form. So don't repeat what I did. To be fair, if I look back at that session, was it good? No. Was it okay? Probably also it wasn't okay. It was probably below average. It scored okay, but that was probably because a lot of people knew me, and they were partly there because they also wanted to see my session because I was attached to it, and they'd read my book or they read some of the blogs, and so I think that helped me get an okay score. But I can tell you, when I got off that stage, man, I've never experienced a feeling like that before in terms of how bad I felt at the end of the session. Yeah, it was horrible, and I also knew then that if I wanted to do this again, I needed to have, first of all, a completely different approach, and then secondly, I also knew I would probably need to do this extremely often to get more comfortable at presenting, because it's not a skill you acquire overnight, that's for sure.
How did you mentally prepare for doing that session once you got locked into it? Like, how did you tell yourself, okay, I need to do this even though I'm dreadfully scared? Just that first time, like, can you deconstruct that part for us?
Yeah, I probably did the thing that I should have never done. And this is also something that I tell people. So, of course, you know what's going to happen. And the one thing that stands out at that point in time is, okay, I can't make any mistakes. So I need to make sure that I hit every single bullet point and I hit every single slide. So what you then tend to do is you tend to over-rehearse things. So I literally knew every single dot, comma, period on every single slide. So I was so over-prepared that it's not like I learned a full script, but it could have been a full script that I've learned. So every single slide I knew what to say, when to say, every single sentence, when to pause, when to go to the next part, etc. And I think that even made it more terrifying for me, because I got extremely scared that I would start forgetting things while I was talking through the deck and talking through the story. And I think that made it probably 10 times worse. So that over-rehearsing part is also something that I tend to emphasize people. Of course, you need to rehearse things, but you don't need to do it 26 times. I would encourage you to rehearse it, because if you don't rehearse it, that first session is going to be a rehearsal for sure. And it's going to come across as a rehearsal. But don't do it 26 or 27 times, because you're going to drive yourself completely nuts, and you're going to get extremely scared that you'll end up forgetting things. And in the end, people don't know what you're going to say anyway. So if you forget something, you can always come back to that point if you want to get that point across. And if it doesn't really matter for the story, you just skip it. And I think that's probably one of the biggest mistakes that I made. I think one of the other things that didn't really help is, of course, it's a huge thing that you get to present at VMworld or Explore, or whether it's an AWS conference or Kubernetes, whatever it ends up being. It could be something completely not related to tech, of course, either. But I made a huge thing out of it for myself, right? It's this big thing that you get to do, and you really need to nail this, because everything that career-wise may happen or may not happen is associated with this, right? And that completely made me even more anxious than I already was. So that's also probably something that I did that I shouldn't have done.
Are you talking about treating that presentation as a career inflection point, like in real time as you were preparing for it?
Yeah, for sure. And I think that is something that is the case for a lot of people, and especially back in the day, you're talking about 12, 13 years ago, being able to attend and present at VMworld, which was a huge thing. There were a lot of people actually going to VMworld, but not everyone was invited to be up on stage, and especially not as a subject matter expert. And in that particular scenario that I was in, though I was writing a lot of content, I was writing most of the content for HA. And if you go back and you look at the book that I wrote, the very first book that I wrote on HA itself, and you compare the content of the book to all of the white papers that were out there for HA, you will notice that they are very similar. Although the white papers all had a different author. Most of those folks creating those white papers actually use my best practices out of the book or out of the blog posts as their content, which I was completely okay with, just to make that clear, because it's the discussion I had with their team. But for me, it very much felt like if I nail this, if I kill this, and they're already using my content, for sure they will hire me for a job in tech marketing or something else to that extent. So for me, it felt like that giant moment could be a giant moment for my career. If I nail this and everyone talks about it, I for sure will easily move up the ranks.
You talked a little bit about the lessons that you learned and the recommendations that you would make, for other people. Don't do this way. How much of that is looking back at that over 10 plus years? And how much of that did you incorporate, into like an immediate lessons learned, in the days or weeks immediately after the conference?
Yeah, one of the things, and I think that's a great question. One of the things I always do is I tend to reflect back fairly quickly, not on the day itself, because usually on the day itself when something happened, whether it's career-wise or, let's say I do a lot of running. Let's say it's running, right? If you didn't hit that PB, there's no point in reflecting on the day itself. You need to take like a day or two just to let it sink in and then figure out, okay, what actually happened? Because if you get into the negative spiral, nothing positive is going to come out of it. So what I actually did afterwards is I tried to figure out for myself, okay, what did I do? What didn't I do? And how can I improve things? So most of the things that I'll tell people are things that I actually learned like after my first 2, 3, 4 presentations, or even after the first presentation. But that is typically in my case because I tend to sit down and reflect back and, okay, try to figure out what happened, why didn't this work, why did it work, and then for myself create some kind of best practice guide to figure out what I should be doing next time to actually improve on these particular skills. And for me, it was fairly straightforward. I knew, I wasn't good at public speaking. I didn't like public speaking. I didn't even like speaking in public. And with speaking in public, I don't mean in front of a group of 700 people. Even during a meeting, when you're in a room with 10 or 12 or 15 people, I normally would not be the person raising my hand and then saying something in front of a group. Even if someone would ask a question and in the group no one would have the answer, I typically wouldn't even raise my hand and provide the answer if I knew the answer to that particular question. So I was never really comfortable in terms of doing that. And that was also one of the main reasons I forced myself to get comfortable with it. Because especially if you work for a larger company, you'll end up in a situation over time when you're in a meeting with your management, with senior leadership, etc. And if someone asks a question, right, and you're capable of answering that question in a decent way, I think that helps raising your profile across the organization. So it's one of those skills which I think is extremely important if you want to grow within a company or personally grow. So that's one of the key reasons I forced myself to do public speaking and speak in public during meetings as well. And I think those two combined helped me a lot over time.
It's an interesting linkage. You're linking the fear of going up on stage and presenting in front of large groups or even medium-sized groups or small groups with the fear of speaking up in just a business meeting. In your mind, it sounds like those two things are connected. And so getting over the fear of one is very closely linked to getting over the fear of the other. Is that correct?
Yeah, more or less. I mean, for me, it was just a matter of, not just a matter of, because it sounds quite small and was actually pretty big, but for me, it was a matter of getting more comfortable in terms of, sharing your opinion and your ideas in front of a group of which you may not know the audience completely. And I think that is part of it. If I would be in a group of my peers and we would have a meeting like back in the days with 5 or 6 professional services consultants or architects, then I would usually be okay speaking up because I typically would know we're all more or less on the same level. But if you're in front of a group, you have no idea who is in the audience. So you don't know what they know, and you also don't know what they don't know. Those are two different things. And the same applies in a meeting. right? You could be sitting with someone, could be sitting next to someone who's extremely deeply technical, who could be an engineer who actually wrote the code that you're discussing or the best practices for. But on the other side, you could also have, the CTO of the company sitting next to you, or the CEO of the company sitting next to you. So it could be all over the place. And that usually, for me, made it more challenging to speak up in those types of settings. And that fear in that setting, in that smaller group, was not the same as the fear of public speaking in front of a large group. I think that for me was 10 times worse in terms of, the level of anxiety that I had. But in some shape or form, it was more or less similar. I just had to force myself to get over, the fact that there could be someone in the audience that knows more than you do. And that's fine. You need to be okay with that. And the other thing that you had to be comfortable with is sometimes saying, I don't know. I'll get back to you. I have no idea how that works, or I don't have the answer for you in this particular scenario. So I'll get back to you. And those are things which I always found very difficult, at least at the start of my career. Now I'm completely okay with that. I'm the first one that will tell people, if they ask me a question that I don't have the answer to, I don't have the answer. That's fine. I'll get back to you tomorrow or the day after when I find out.
Yeah, we tend to think that if we don't know all the answers, especially when you're presenting in front of a group, that it somehow makes you lesser or makes your reputation go down. But you're right. Saying, I don't know, I'll go figure it out and get back to you. That's a great response because it helps you learn and it helps them learn too.
Yeah, and it's a much better response than trying to, come up with a story which is incorrect. And you see a lot of people doing that. You ask them a question. And I've seen this so many times because I used to be part of the VCDX panel. So we would assess people that would do an exam, an oral exam, and would try to explain why they made certain design decisions. And I would ask them a question, trying to figure out, if they actually knew the technical reason behind that. And sometimes you could see in their eyes that they had no idea. And then they would try to come up with this story why they actually did that. And for me, right, that is probably, the worst thing you can do. It's 10 times better to say, okay, I don't know from the top of my head. At that particular point in time, we had technical reasons to do it. I forgot to document them. I'll make sure I'll add them to the document next time. It's also not the best answer you can give, but it's at least 10 times better than, trying to come up with a story which is incorrect. Because then what's going to happen next, especially when you're in that situation, when there's someone sitting next to you who probably does know the answer, he's going to keep poking. He's going to keep trying to figure out, okay, every single question, does he actually know or does he not know the answer, right? So it's just going to get worse. So you may as well say that you don't know. And that's fine. And most people are okay with it. I've never had a situation when someone said, I don't accept that answer, right? If you don't know, you don't know.
Yes. I feel like maybe we've skipped a step here, which is, step one, be the subject matter expert. Step two, let's proceed to how to be an effective presenter of that information. I think in the industry, you're known as an extremely prolific writer, blogger, content creator, podcasts, blogs, white papers, books. Can you talk me through the process that you used? It seems like you're fairly methodical in, how you step back and assess your performance in public speaking. What was that methodology when it came to learning content and then writing about it and then, writing about it in an authoritative way?
That's an interesting process as well. And it's funny because I really haven't given it much thought in terms of, that I had a plan in terms of how I would go through that whole experience. For me personally, the way that I learn things is by writing things out. And the way that I get to understand how something really works is by creating a really long article and then trying to condense it to 1 or 2 paragraphs. That's it. That's the way I actually get to learn how something really works in depth. And I know some people work, complete opposite way. If you look at, for instance, the articles that I sometimes write, and you compare it to an article that someone like Frank Denneman writes. Frank will write 64 pages on Numa. If I would have to write the same thing, it probably would be 1 page. And that's not because I can't write 64 pages, but it's because of how I try to distill things down to the core. And he likes to get into the weeds because that helps him really understanding how things work end to end. And for me, the way I work, it's the opposite. So, and I think that is something that I've done throughout my career. Of course, when you write a deep dive book, of course, you need to include all of the information that you have. You're not going to condense HA from 88 pages down to 16 pages because then it actually loses its value. But for most of the blog articles, for instance, I always try to condense things as much as possible. And that has always helped me hugely. One of the things that I'll tend to do is, if there's a particular topic, when I started out with vSAN, for instance, I'll just try to break things down to smaller parts. So if you look at a storage system, right, a storage system always consists of multiple components. Or if you look at the hypervisor itself, or vCenter server, it always consists of multiple components. So what I do is I write down those components, and then I'll look at each of the components and see, okay, what's part of the component? What does it do? And then I'll break it down again, and I'll break it down again, and I'll break it down again until I have 60 small things. And then I'll try to figure out for every part of that whole thing what those 60 smaller things do. And after I figure those 60 things out, I'll try to tie it back together. So I'll try to bring it back down to that one big thing again. So that is the way that it actually works in my brain. And it's funny because I always assumed that it worked the same for everyone else. And I just recently had to sit down with my daughter, and she had to do an assignment for school. And then I realized that's not how it works for everyone else. She sees one big component, sees this big thing, and she's not capable of actually breaking it down in 6 smaller things. And you have each of those 6 smaller items become an additional 10 different items. So I really had to help her to go through that process, creating that outline more or less in terms of how, okay, this is where you start, this is how you break it down, and this is how you bring it back together. And that's something that I've always done. And this is also something that I try to do with my presentations, to be honest. So when I present, for instance, I'll typically start out with an introduction. Then I'll break that introduction down into smaller chunks. And then at the end, I'll try to bring it back together. Because I always feel that, especially for a presentation, but the same applies to an article or to a book, you typically have to repeat yourself at least 3 or 4 times before you get the point across. And that has nothing to do with the way you communicate. It's just the way how people process information. So, and that's what I tend to do in my head anyway. So I may as well use the same outline for a blog post, for a book, or for a presentation.
That's interesting. It matches a pattern that we've seen of, turning information into knowledge. A couple different things there. The first, I think it kind of follows the pattern of like writing is thinking. You can consume information and distill it in your own mind, but unless you're writing it down, it's ephemeral, right? This idea that like you're just going to digest it and keep it in your brain there's too many things to know in order for that to really work. We talked about this book. It's called How to Take Smart Notes by Sanka Ahrens, and the Zettelkasten and note-taking system, which really seems to follow this exact pattern that you're talking about of breaking things down, restating them in your own words, and then trying to really distill it down until it's like the nugget of this thing, almost in like a, ready to publish format. And then you can drop that into a white paper or a presentation or an email. It can be repurposed over and over again. So I asked that question wondering, what your process was. It's very interesting to see that it follows a pattern that we've come across before, but not everybody's pattern.
True.
Here's what fascinates me, Duncan. It's sort of like your method of the going deep at first, right? Writing out this big, long article and trying to condense it. It's almost like that process writes the presentation for you, because once you get down to the couple of paragraphs that you want to distill it to, you can kind of take your bullet points from there. Like, did that naturally happen as a byproduct of the way you started writing to then affect your presentations? Or, did your process switch at any point because of all the writing?
No, I think that actually naturally happened. And I did a lot of writing before I actually started presenting, in general. So I think that that whole process in terms of writing helped me creating my presentations as well and trying to convey this particular story. And to be honest, when I started writing, this was long before I started Yellow Bricks. So before I actually I owned or started Yellow Bricks, I had a pretty big community forum / website which all revolved around hardcore punk. So it was this type of music, loud music. And I would write, reviews for albums that were released, interviews with bands, etc. I mean, it's all amateuristic, nothing professional, but that writing has always been something that was part of me, and that definitely helps processing information in some shape or form, or think about things in a particular way, and also think about, okay, what do people actually want to know about this particular thing, whether that's a CD or slash an album, or whether it's a product or a feature, doesn't really matter, right? You really need to understand what people would like to know about that particular, what kind of style of music it is, or how many songs there are, how many virtual machines can be restarted by HA, all of those different things. Those could be things that customers or readers would be interested in. And that's one of those things that always got me going, trying to figure out, okay, if I would read this myself, what are the 5 things that I would like to get out of it? What should I learn at the end of this conversation? And that applies to both writing a blog article, but also when you do a presentation. One of the most challenging things, and I've had this before many times, you get asked, to present at an event. The first thing I ask them, okay, what is the audience? Who is the audience? Because if I don't understand who the audience is, then it's going to be very difficult to actually present something useful. I just had it this week, and I had this whole conversation with someone, and they asked me to present something specific. First of all, I'm not a subject matter expert on it. Yeah, I know there are stock PowerPoint decks that I could use, but that's not going to add much. And then secondly, when we started talking about the audience, I quickly found out that the audience was also not what I would expect it normally to be if they would ask me to present something. So yeah, the conversation quickly changed, because then I don't see much value in terms of what I could bring to the table for that particular event. So I think those are always very important things. You need to understand who the audience is, and also what you think the audience would be interested in. And when you write blogs, and it doesn't really matter what the subject is, you'll quickly find out if it's interesting or not, because people will be reading it or they will not be reading it. And the same applies to a presentation. You can quickly see if people are interested or not. You see it in their faces, and you will notice it after the session as well. People will thank you for the content that you delivered, or if it goes completely silent and no one says anything, well, it probably wasn't as good as you thought it would be. So you have that fairly quick feedback loop regardless, I think. So yeah, I think those things are really important. Try to figure out what customers, readers, or listeners would want to consume. I think that is something that is probably one of the key things.
I just wanted to follow up with something that Nick said, and I'm not sure if we pin that down. Are you a write the document, and then translate it into a presentation person? Is that your process? Or do you sit down with a blank slide deck and try to fill out slides for a presentation?
That's a good question. And I think this is something that more people probably should do when they get started, when they create their first PowerPoint deck, or even when it's the 20th. But the first thing that I typically tend to do is I try to figure out what I want to talk about. You come up with a particular topic to discuss, or a focus area. And then for that particular focus area, I try to write down, okay, what are the 5 things that I should be discussing during this particular session, during my presentation, or 6 things or 7 things, doesn't really matter, right? But you need to have an X number of things you want to discuss. So you have this overarching theme, like let's say in my particular case, I want to talk about stretch cluster configurations for vSAN. Okay, that is going to be the broader topic. Okay, what are the things that I want to discuss during that presentation itself? Okay, well, there are a couple of things that customers would probably be interested in. Could be the configuration part, could be the best practices, could be some of the handling of particular failure scenarios. Those different types of things I will always write down. Then I typically create a deck, which is just an empty slide deck with a title. I'll create sections in the deck that align with the 5 or 6 items that I wrote down. And then per item, I'll start creating slides, and then I'll try to figure out if it actually makes sense. Now, the interesting part, of course, is always that when you do the first rehearsal, and I always do a rehearsal, probably even 4 or 5 in total, if it's a new deck, you'll notice that some slides work, some slides don't work, some sections work, some sections don't work, some sections need to move up or move down. But that's typically when you figure out if something actually flows well or not. But I always write it down first, and then I'll go through different iterations. And sometimes, because if you look at the amount of content that has been created, especially when you work for a company like Broadcom/VMware, there are 1,000 slides that you can reuse. So if you look at, for us internally, we have people like Pete Keeler. They've created thousands and thousands of slides. If I can reuse one of his slides, I'll reuse one of his slides. But it also happens fairly often that I need to create my own slides because there is no content for what I want to talk about. So I'll do that as well. Depends on what you're talking about. But I always write it down first, and then I'll add it to a slide deck and try to start adding different layers where needed.
And I'm assuming when you write down a topic, it's probably something that you've already written a best practice about, or it's in a guide somewhere, or maybe even in a book or internal document.
Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. I mean, I get asked to do presentations on things as well that I haven't written any content about, or, it's something that is fairly new. One of the things that I'm responsible for as a chief technologist is also partly the strategy and the roadmap of the features and functionality set that at least the part of the BU that I work in is responsible for. So sometimes you need to create slides for things that don't exist just yet. Last week even I created a slide for one of the PMs of a feature that I requested, 6-7 years ago, and they're now starting to work on it, or at least exploring it. So I created that slide for him, and I'm actually going to, after this recording, I'll be creating a Confluence page on a feature that I requested as well, which the engineering team is trying to figure out, but they're not sure where to start yet. So I'm going to write out that story. So sometimes, you write about stuff that doesn't exist just yet, and sometimes it may already exist, or it may be based on an article that I've already done. I've also done presentations in the past, indeed, based on an article that I wrote. So that happens. It could be a mix. Of course, it's 10 times easier to create a slide deck when you've already written an article about it, because you exactly know what you want to talk about. If you don't know what you're going to talk about, it's slightly more complex. But when you do this, almost on a daily basis, it gets a bit easier. Of course, when it's a presentation in front of a large audience, you need to make sure that slide deck works end to end, right? Every single bullet point needs to be spot on. But when it's a meeting with a customer, then I can grab 20 slides, talk through the slides, and then you get to certain areas where you may not have any content, but you still get that discussion going. And as a result, it still works. So because I've done it so many times, I'm quite flexible in terms of how I can talk to particular diagrams, or I can grab a random diagram and explain something else, for instance. But that's just because of all the experience that you'll have. Typically, I would make sure, of course, I have a very well prepared deck and actually can go over the content that I'm supposed to be going over.
If you map out a presentation like you mentioned, Duncan, with the 5 to 7 major things that you want to say, and then you give that presentation to a specific audience, let's say it's really technical people, and then you maybe need to deliver the same content to a less technical audience or people in a slightly different role, do you find yourself changing the content on the slides, changing the way you talk about it and the level of depth, or both?
I mean, it kind of depends on how deep the slide deck is. I've had some decks in the past that definitely weren't, suitable for anything other than an administrator, a consultant, or an architect. I wouldn't be able to talk about, the slides to anyone else than that, simply because of the level of depth that they would go into. When you talk about advanced settings, log files, etc., it's almost impossible to explain or talk through that at an extremely high level. Of course you can, but then the content is not going to be very useful. You can say, okay, this is a log file and all the useful information that your employees will need is in there. They're not going to get much out of that. But in most cases, what we tend to do these days is that most of the content is, I shouldn't say high level. It's not extremely high level, but it's at a certain level where you can talk to administrators, you can talk to architects, you can talk to consultants, but you can also talk to a management level, and maybe even slightly higher than that. And in that particular case, I may remove 1 or 2 slides that are too geeky, but I'll just keep the higher level slides, which then allow me to talk through the story anyway. And typically have multiple stories going on at the same time, so that's usually not an issue.
I just want to go back to one other thing you talked about in these aspects of like a customer meeting compared to a presentation. In a customer meeting or just an internal meeting at whatever company I work for, if I'm a listener, I might be sharing a best practice and it could be very interactive, very conversational with the audience. Do you feel more comfortable when giving a presentation to any audience when it's conversational versus not conversational? How does the amount of conversationalness or conversational level translate to the type of presentation you're giving, if that makes sense?
Conversationality is the right word.
Yeah, that's a better word.
It's probably a word that does exist.
I just made that up.
No, yeah, I mean, to me, it really doesn't matter at this stage. Although I must say, if I'm in front of a group of customers, you're not up on the stage, of course, it's 10 times easier. You just sit down, you have a cup of coffee, and you go over a slide deck that is presented on the screen, or whether it's a projector or just a regular stream doesn't really matter. You have a conversation, you talk about the slides, you get a question here and there, which then allows you to talk about certain areas. Of course, is a bit easier, but it's also because of the setting. It's much more relaxed, right? It's much different when you're up on stage and you've got 400 people or 2,000 people staring at you, and it's not scary anymore. But you still get nervous. But when you're in a group of 20 people and you're just discussing what's up on the screen, and someone asks a question, you can go into that particular focus area. It's different. It's not. That's something that I've done so many times over the past 10 years that I'm not too concerned about that anymore. You can walk into any customer at this stage, grab a deck, and have a discussion, and then feel fully comfortable about it. Which, of course, is different when you need to present in front of a group. When you do a keynote and there's 500 people sitting there, well, you still need to make sure you know your story end to end. And if you mess up, there's 500 people staring at you. When you're in a group of 20 people, you can always say, okay, let's take 5 steps back, and then it's not an issue. It probably wasn't a set agenda in the first place. So it's different when you do a keynote in that situation.
It's a matter of stakes, isn't it? The level of importance of what's going on and the how bad a falling flat on your face, figuratively or even literally in front of a group is. If it's a 500 people or 1,000 people, obviously it's worse.
For sure.
I really like the way Duncan described his brain and how he learns things. Taking a high-level concept and breaking it into smaller and smaller pieces to understand how everything works together, but then putting it all back together again, just like those people we've interviewed who like to take computers apart, put them back together so they could understand how the system works together. Duncan told us that he takes a long article and condenses it, and that's his way of distilling concepts down to the core. We didn't really talk about it in the episode, but this act of summarization or brevity is really a skill, and I think that's a skill that we can use when we communicate with people at higher levels in an organization than we are. At your level, you're going to have the details of a problem you're working on that no one else has, at a deep level of detail. When you communicate that to your manager or your manager's manager, you're going to have to be a little more brief than you might be when speaking to another individual contributor at your same level. They need to know what the problem is, some idea of what's going on, and what action or help you might need from them. So I think this is something that we can practice in our writing, and it will help us in our communication. And if you're someone who doesn't feel comfortable speaking up in meetings, especially when leadership is on, maybe you need to practice that art of brevity and distilling things down to the root or the core, as Duncan was talking about. Think about it and see if speaking up and speaking a little bit differently up to your leaders might make a different impact once you do a little summarization. Also, if writing is thinking and a way to think through and process information, it is a 100% transferable skill across different areas. Duncan shared that he used to have a site or a community that was focused on music. writing album reviews, writing interviews with artists. So it doesn't matter what we're writing. We are thinking and processing information as we're doing it. And oh, by the way, if you're going to be thinking a lot on a topic that's relevant in your field, why not write it down and put it on a blog so it's publicly accessible and referenceable on a resume, findable by a recruiter and a hiring manager? Just a thought. If you're looking for more information on presentations and how you can get better at doing that, I'd encourage you to check out episodes 73 and 74 with our guest Al Rashid. Those are both great discussions on how Al got comfortable with and prepared for presentations in front of large groups of people in the technology community. Great stories to learn from. And if you're looking to dip a toe into presenting, maybe you don't want to go all the way and try to present at a technology conference, user groups are a great idea. User groups centered on a specific technology, for example, that's something you're working on. Go back and listen to episode 230 with Chris Williams. He talks about being a user group leader and how everyone who attends the user group actually wants the people who present to do well. Another place you can go to get better at public speaking is, of course, join Toastmasters. That's something that Larry Roberts highlighted in our discussion with him in episode 254. And I know we've had at least one other guest, I believe it was Yvette Edwards, highlight Toastmasters at making them a better communicator and presenter. Next week, we're going to talk to Duncan a little bit about what it takes to become a Chief Technologist. We'll catch you then.
Farewell, listeners. Tune in next time as the journey continues. I'm John White at VJourneyman, for Nick Cordy at NetworkNerd_, signing off.
Adios.